The ballroom of Lady Agnes Fellowes' house on Cavendish Square blazed with light from 3 rows of chandeliers. 200 guests drifted through the warm January air in their finest attire. The orchestra played a reel with such confidence that no one felt obliged to actually dance. It was the kind of evening meant for discussion the following morning. The food would earn praise, the gowns would be scrutinized, the gossip would be refined and spread like seed. No one paid particular attention when the double doors at the far end opened. The season had not truly begun. It was only January 28th, and London was still stirring after Christmas. Each new arrival brought a mild freshness. A name was announced. A guest entered. The room absorbed them. Then the footman spoke a name, and the room did something rare. It paused. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was more like a collective held breath moving through the crowd in a slow wave, from the doors outward, guest by guest. Even those nearest the orchestra seemed to sense it, without knowing why. Conversations softened rather than stopped. Heads tilted rather than turned. The chandeliers kept blazing. She stood in the doorway in a gown of pale lavender silk, its empire waist trimmed with a narrow band of black velvet ribbon that caught the light with her slightest movement. Her sleeves were short and slightly puffed at the shoulder. Her long gloves were a shade between ivory and grey. Her dark auburn hair was styled high and threaded with a single black ribbon. 8 months out of full mourning, she wore those months with an exactness that suggested every choice had been deliberate. She did not dress to make a statement. She dressed as a woman who understood everything she did made a statement, and had chosen her own. Honora, Duchess of Aldenmere, stepped into the room. Across the ballroom, near the far windows where thick curtains muffled the January cold, a man in a dark coat held a glass of wine he hadn't touched in some time. He had been speaking with Lord Hathaway about his Wiltshire estate, listening with the practiced attention of a man who gave half his mind to the room and half to whatever social duty required. He turned. Later, he wouldn't know why. No sound, no movement at the edge of his vision should have drawn him. The footman's announcement of her name had been lost beneath the orchestra, yet he turned as if someone had called his own. He saw her instantly. 5 years. He registered it the moment he registered her face. Those 5 years, their particular weight and texture, the way they had accumulated not as time, but as absence. He felt Hathaway still speaking beside him. He felt his own fingers around the wine glass. He felt, in some distant, stunned part of himself, the precise temperature of the air in his lungs. She looked across the room. Their eyes met. He couldn't have said afterwards how long it lasted. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Long enough that it wasn't accidental, not a glance misdirected and quickly averted. Long enough that both knew the other had seen, had not looked away immediately, and had chosen at last to look away rather than being forced by some third party. The room breathed again. The orchestra played on. Lady Agnes appeared at Honora's side, both hands extended, with a cry of genuine warmth. The moment closed like a door, quietly, leaving no mark on the wallpaper, the chandelier glass, or the faces of any of the 200 guests who had, after all, noticed nothing particular. Bertram Ravenscroft set his wine glass on the nearest surface and didn't pick it up again that evening. She had loved him first. That was the one thing she could never explain to anyone, not even Agnes, because there was no way to say it that didn't sound like an excuse. That she had loved him before the Duke's proposal. That she had loved him through the summer of 1812 and into the autumn. That when the letter came from Thomas, her youngest brother, 20 years old and ruined, her first thought hadn't been of the Duke's offer at all, but of Bertram, and the way he had looked at her the last time she'd seen him, at a garden party in Surrey, standing with his hands clasped behind him, his verdejade eyes following her across the lawn as if he were working something out. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? I read every single one, and I want you to know, this story is a work of original historical fiction, written to be heard and felt, not lived. The history is ours. The choices belong only to Honora. This is the story of a woman who made the only choice she believed she could make, and spent 5 years discovering whether she had been right. It is the story of a man who thought he had been abandoned, and spent 3 of those years knowing the truth, yet not knowing what to do with it. It is, beneath all of that, a love story. Which is to say, It is a story about two people being very foolish and very brave in that particular sequence that love requires. London, January 1817. The season is beginning, and Honora Sinclair, once merely the second daughter of a minor Shropshire baronet, now styled Honora, Duchess of Aldenmere, widowed these 8 months past, has returned to the city that holds the one conversation she has been putting off for 5 years. She didn't expect him to be at Agnes's ball. She should have expected him to be at Agnes's ball. Agnes was Bertram's cousin. Agnes had never stopped being fond of Bertram, or of Honora, or of the way things might have been had the summer of 1812 ended differently. Agnes had in fact written to Honora 3 separate letters in the 6 months before this evening, each one mentioning, in passing like the weather, that Bertram had inherited the earldom upon his father's death in 1814, that he had spent much of the intervening years in Yorkshire managing the estate, and that he was expected in London this January. Honora had read those letters with the particular attention of someone not paying attention. She had noted the information about the earldom. She had noted nothing else. Or so she had told herself, on the carriage ride through the cold Mayfair streets tonight, her breath visible in the January dark, her hands folded in her lap, her lady's maid Prudence sitting across from her, silent because Prudence understood the particular shape of her mistress's silences and which ones welcomed company and which did not. She hadn't expected him to be there. She had known in some room of herself she did not willingly visit that he would be. William Aldenmere, the 4th Duke, had been 56 years old when Honora married him in October of 1812. He had been kind in the way men who have never needed to be unkind are kind, without effort or consciousness as a natural condition. He had not been cruel, he had not been cold. He had been, like many men of his generation and station, simply elsewhere, present at meals, present for the formal requirements of a household, present in the way very large pieces of furniture are present, providing structure without requiring acknowledgement. He had cleared Thomas's debts on the morning of their wedding, all of them. £3,040 owed to men whose patience had been, by Thomas's own admission, nearly exhausted. The Duke had done this without ceremony or condition, and he had never, in the 4 years of their marriage that followed, mentioned it again. She had been grateful. She had remained grateful. She hadn't been in love with him, and she hadn't pretended to be, and he hadn't asked her to pretend. Their marriage had been, she sometimes thought of it as a room, a warm room, well furnished, with a fire that burned steadily and never threw sparks. She had lived in that room, she had been safe in it. When he died in May of 1816, of a chest complaint that had troubled him mildly for 2 years and severely for 3 months, she had wept. She had wept for a long time, and she hadn't been entirely certain, in the weeks afterwards, what she was weeping for, the Duke himself or the life she had built in that quiet room or the other life, the one she hadn't lived, which had a way of sitting beside her at strange moments and looking at her without speaking. Thomas had come to Aldenmere House the week after the funeral. He was 25 now and married, with a child and a modest house in Bloomsbury, his debts so thoroughly erased that he sometimes seemed to have no memory of them. He sat across from Honora in the morning room and drank tea and talked carefully around the question he actually wanted to ask. She had let him talk around it for 20 minutes before she said, "I'm all right, Thomas." He had looked at her over his cup. "Are you going to London for the season?" "In January, perhaps. Agnes has written." "Agnes," he said, and then, "Ravenscroft has his father's earldom now, you know." "Yes," she said. "I know." He had said nothing else about it, and she had been glad, because she hadn't trusted herself to hear anything else about it without her face doing something she would prefer it not do. That had been 6 months ago, and now she was here in Agnes's ballroom, and Bertram Ravenscroft was across the room with an untouched glass of wine and those verde jade eyes that always made her think of the conservatory at Ravenscroft Park in summer, and she had looked away first because she had to look somewhere, and the chandeliers were no help at all. She did not speak to him that evening. This wasn't precisely a decision. It was more like the space left by a decision that kept almost happening and then not happening as the evening moved through its stages. Supper announced, dancing begun, the warm press of the room raising the temperature by several degrees, so that the footman opened the windows a careful inch, and let in threads of January air. Agnes found her within minutes of her arrival, held both her hands and said, "You look absolutely beautiful, and I am furious with you for staying away so long." And Honora had laughed properly for the first time in what felt like weeks. Agnes Fellows was the kind of woman who made rooms easier to be in. Bright-minded, direct, generous without ostentation, with a husband who was perpetually content and a social circle wide enough to encompass nearly everyone and narrow enough to exclude the people worth excluding. "Bertram is here," Agnes said after a few minutes quite casually, in the tone of someone who had been waiting to say a thing and was relieved to have said it. "I know," Honora said. "He saw you come in." "I know that too." Agnes looked at her with a particular expression, not quite sympathy, not quite satisfaction, but something in between that only close friends are permitted. "Are you going to speak to him?" "Not tonight," Honora said. "Tonight is when he's here." "Agnes, I'm just noting," Agnes said, and said nothing further on the subject and was in this way an excellent friend. Honora drank 2 glasses of lemonade and spoke to Lord and Lady Pemberton, old friends of the Duke's, and to Mrs. Carrington from Surrey, whom she hadn't seen in 3 years, and to a young woman named Miss Vane, who was having her first season and was attempting to conceal her terror beneath a very good gown. She danced once, a country dance with Agnes's husband Richard, who danced without flair or error, like a man who had decided long ago to be reliable rather than elegant, and she found herself grateful for its simplicity. She was aware of Bertram Ravenscroft throughout all of it, in the way one is aware of a weather system, not constantly attended to, but impossible to ignore entirely. He was taller than she had remembered, or perhaps she had simply forgotten the particular set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, not rigid but contained, everything folded inward unless he chose to extend it. Dark coat, white cravat, the verde jade eyes that she was resolutely not looking at, and was therefore completely certain of their location at all times. She saw him talk to Hathaway and then to a cluster of men near the card room. She saw him laugh at something, a real laugh, quick and private, the kind that creased the corner of his eye. She remembered that laugh. She had spent 5 years occasionally remembering it at inconvenient moments, like the middle of the night. At 10:30, she found herself briefly alone near the east windows. Agnes had been drawn away by a domestic emergency involving the supper arrangements, and for approximately 90 seconds she stood with a view across the room and the particular cold creeping in through the window inch at her back, and she thought, "I could leave before he speaks to me. I could simply have my carriage called. It would be very easy." She did not leave. He did not approach. She went into supper with the Pembertons and sat between Lord Pemberton and a naval captain whose name she did not catch, and ate a roasted chicken she did not taste, and laughed at a story about a retriever she barely heard, and drove home at midnight in her carriage with Prudence across from her in London, moving past outside, and did not permit herself to think about anything in particular until she was alone in her room and the candle was out and the dark was its own kind of privacy. Then she pressed her hands flat to her sternum, felt her heart's percussion against her palms and thought, 5 years and he still does that. She had no vocabulary for how maddening that was. She was a widow of 8 months, a duchess of 4 years, a woman who had made difficult choices and lived in them without flinching. And he had done nothing at all, simply stood across a room and existed, and her chest had conducted itself like a second-rate orchestra, playing a piece it didn't quite know. In the morning, she wrote a note to Agnes, thanking her for the evening. She did not mention Bertram. Agnes would know she didn't mention him and would know why and would say nothing about it, which was precisely what was required. Honora sealed the note and rang for Prudence, and looked out at the grey January square and thought about 5 years ago, and what she had written, and what she had not. The summer of 1812 had a particular quality of light she had never quite managed to replicate in her memory, or rather, she replicated it too exactly, which was the problem. She would be doing something perfectly ordinary, reading in the morning room, speaking to Mrs. Alcott about the household accounts, and the light would come through a window at a certain angle, warm and particulate, and she would be somewhere else entirely. A garden party at Ashfield Park in Hampshire, July 1812. The Renfield cousins had rented Ashfield for the summer and invited half of the county, and Honora had come with her mother and her sister Clara and had fully expected to find it tedious, in the pleasant way of things one doesn't particularly want, but doesn't particularly resist. She had met Bertram Ravenscroft on the second afternoon by the lake, where he was attempting to help his friend Hattersham's daughter retrieve a shuttlecock from an oak tree with the solemn concentration of a man engaged in genuinely important work. He was 24, heir to the Ravenscroft earldom, dark-haired and quietly watchful, like people who prefer to understand a room before they decide to enter it. He looked up when she approached, and the shuttlecock fell out of the tree on its own, and he said, "Well, that saves me the climb." She had laughed. That was how it started, in the way the best things start, with something small and ordinary, a fall of light, a falling shuttlecock, a laugh that surprised both people involved. Over the following 6 weeks, they were brought together repeatedly by the structure of a house party, meals, excursions, evening entertainments. Then, when the house party ended and the company moved in parts to London for the autumn, they found themselves at the same assemblies and dinners often enough that it stopped being coincidence and began to be something else. He called on her mother twice. She danced with him 3 times at a single ball, and her mother said nothing about it, which was itself a form of comment. He had a way of listening she hadn't encountered before in a man of his age and station, not the performance of listening, the occasional nod and the eyes already composing a response, but the actual thing, eyes on her face, a slight tilt of the head, and silence that invited her to continue. She had told him things about her father, who had died 2 years earlier, about Thomas, who was clever and reckless in equal measure, about her own life, which was comfortable and small, and which she had a recurring guilty feeling she was supposed to want more from. He told her about Ravenscroft Park in Yorkshire and the tenant farms, and the particular difficulty of managing an estate his father managed first and better, and the odd loneliness of being a man's heir, and therefore, in some accounting, a man waiting to become himself. She had always remembered precisely its texture, sitting beside him on a bench in the garden of the Hattersham house one afternoon in September, the London autumn beginning to catch in the leaves above them, and thinking, I could spend the rest of my life in conversations like this. I could spend the rest of my life sitting next to him on a bench in somebody else's garden, and I wouldn't need the garden or the autumn or the bench at all. She hadn't said this. She had said something ordinary about the rose bushes, and he had said something about Yorkshire not being much for roses, and they had gone inside for tea. She was certain, she remained certain 5 years later, that he had been about to propose. She had felt it in the way one sometimes feels a change in the weather, not seeing it, not hearing it, simply knowing it in the body, in the skin, in the particular attention of the air. He had been about to propose probably at the Hattersham house party in Derbyshire in late September, to which both their families had been invited. She had not gone to Derbyshire. She had received Thomas's letter on the 17th of September, 1812. He was in London. The debts were £3,040. The men he owed them to were not patient. He had written the letter at 2 in the morning, and she could feel the terror in every line of it. The handwriting that was his but tighter, smaller, pressed into the page as though he were trying to make himself very small too. Their mother had no money. There was no money. Their father had left the Sinclair estate clear of debts but bare of anything else, and the income from the small tenancy that remained was enough to keep the house and maintain the household, but not enough, not nearly enough for £3,040. She had written to Bertram immediately. A letter, careful, composed, explaining that she could not come to Derbyshire, that there was a family matter, that she hoped to explain more fully when she could. She hadn't told him about Thomas, not in that letter. She hadn't known then that there would not be another letter. The Duke of Aldenmere's offer came through a mutual acquaintance, a solicitor named Mr. Petch, who had handled some minor business for the Sinclairs and had apparently mentioned in a conversation with the Duke's secretary that Lady Honora Sinclair was a sensible young woman of good family. The Duke had met her once at an assembly in the spring. He wanted a wife. He had been widowed for 11 years and he was 56, and he wanted someone to manage Aldenmere House with competence and good sense. He was willing to settle the Sinclair household debts and provide an allowance for Mrs. Sinclair. He was willing to address immediately and entirely any pressing family obligations. She had sat with this offer for one night. She had thought about Bertram for all of that night, and in the morning she had thought about Thomas and about the particular look on Thomas's face when he had been 12 years old, and she had found him by the river at the bottom of the Sinclair garden, crying in the way boys who are not supposed to cry hide in tall grass to cry, and she had sat with him without saying anything until he stopped. She wrote 2 letters that morning. The first went to Mr. Petch, accepting the Duke's terms. The second she addressed to Bertram Ravenscroft. She wrote it 4 times before she was satisfied. The final version said that she had accepted an offer of marriage to another, that the match had been arranged out of necessity she could not fully explain here, that she was deeply sorry for any pain this caused, that she had valued. She had written and crossed out and rewritten this part. That she had valued what had grown between them beyond what she had words for, and that she wished him every happiness. She had given the letter to the footman to post. She had watched him take it away. She had sat for a long time in the morning room and felt something tear very quietly in the middle of her chest, as though a seam had given way, and then she had put on her gloves and gone to find her mother. She had never received a reply. She called on Agnes 2 days after the ball on a bright cold Tuesday morning, which was when Agnes received and expected to be called upon. Agnes's drawing room was warm and yellow-curtained and smelled of coffee and beeswax. Agnes was already in it when Honora arrived, with a friend named Mrs. Carrow, who departed after 15 minutes with the efficiency of someone who had read the social weather correctly. Agnes poured more coffee and looked at Honora across the cups with the expression of a woman who had a great deal to say and was prepared to say none of it unless invited. Honora set down her cup. "He looks well," she said. "He does," Agnes agreed. "Has he said anything to you about the evening?" "He came for breakfast yesterday." Agnes paused. "He ate 4 pieces of toast and spoke about the state of his Wiltshire fields and the likelihood of snow before Easter, and he did not once mention your name, which, as you know, is exactly as informative as if he had said it 17 times. Honora looked at the curtains. "He won't call," she said. "There's no reason he would call." Agnes made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Agnes." "I didn't say anything. You made a sound." "The sound was involuntary," Agnes said. "I will try to prevent it in future." Honora sat with this for a moment. The coffee cooled slowly in her cup. Outside the window, a cart passed, the horse's breath visible in the cold, and a crossing sweeper worked the corner with methodical patience. London in January, grey and purposeful, and beneath the grey, waiting. She was still sitting there, 20 minutes later, when the footman came to announce Lord Ravenscroft. The knowledge that she had been half expecting this, had sat here for 20 minutes partly as a result of half expecting this, did not make his appearance less difficult when it arrived. She heard the name. She felt her spine straighten by approximately 1/4 of an inch, which was apparently what her body had decided was the appropriate response. She looked at Agnes, who wore a perfectly innocent expression she had clearly been practicing. He came into the room in his greatcoat, which he had not yet surrendered to the footman, pulling off his gloves, and he stopped when he saw her. 3 full seconds, as at the ball. Then he continued into the room. "Honora," Agnes said, "you know Lord Ravenscroft, I believe." "We are acquainted," Honora said, which was so inadequate a description that she felt a flicker of something almost like humour at the base of her throat. Bertram Ravenscroft stood just inside the doorway with his gloves in his hand, and looked at her with those verdi jade eyes that gave away precisely nothing, and said, "Your Grace?" A pause, barely perceptible. "You are looking well." "Thank you," she said. "As are you, my lord." Agnes ordered more coffee with the briskness of someone who had decided to be useful. Lord Ravenscroft sat, and for the next 45 minutes they spoke, all 3 of them, about the season and the cold, and Agnes's plans for a musical evening in March. Honora noted with the part of her mind that observed such things as a matter of survival that Bertram was very good at this. At the surface of conversation, the maintenance of the social form that kept everything running without requiring anyone to say anything real. He had always been good at it, She had been one of the people, she thought, to whom he had not used it when it was for him. She was leaving, and Agnes was in the hall making arrangements with the footman when he spoke to her directly for the first time since she had arrived. "Do you stay long in London?" She paused, pulling on her glove. "The season, I expect. And perhaps beyond." He nodded. He was looking at her glove, or perhaps at the wall, or at some middle distance that was neither. "I am glad," he said, and then stopped, as though he had intended to say something after that and changed his mind. She waited. He looked at her directly. His jaw was set in the way she remembered, a particular tension that meant he was choosing his words with more care than usual. "I am glad you came back to London," he said. It wasn't a large thing to say. It was entirely possible to hear it as a simple social courtesy. She wasn't certain she heard it that way. She finished pulling on her glove, and she said, "Good afternoon, my lord," and went out into the cold, her heart conducting itself again in its unreliable manner, and got into her carriage and looked at her own hands in her lap all the way home. The study at Ravenscroft House in Grosvenor Square was still in certain particulars his father's study. There had been changes, his own books on the lower shelves, his own correspondence in the top drawer, a portrait of his mother he had moved from the library to here because he liked to see her face when he was working. But the desk was his father's desk, the same heavy mahogany Bertram had sat across from as a boy, and the chair behind it still carried, at certain angles of the afternoon light, a faint impression of his father's presence. His father had been a formidable man, not cruel, the word had never applied, but exacting in the way of men who build their lives on structure and expect those within their orbit to appreciate the security of that structure, whether they had chosen it or not. He had liked Bertram to be sensible. He had liked Bertram's choices to be legible. The right school, the right club, the right set of friends, the right eventual wife. He had approved of Bertram's prospects. He had not approved of Bertram's attachment to the second daughter of a Shropshire baronet, whose family, while perfectly respectable, was not what he considered the natural match for a Ravenscroft. He had never said this directly to Bertram. He hadn't needed to. His father had been very good at saying things without saying them. Bertram had spent the autumn of 1812 in an escalating bewilderment. He would not, even now, entirely dignify with the word grief, though that was what it had been. The letter from Honora explaining she could not come to Derbyshire. Then 2 weeks later the news, not from her but from Hathawsham, who had heard it from someone who had heard it from Mrs. Carrington, that Lady Honora Sinclair had married the Duke of Aldenmere. No further explanation, no further letter. He had concluded, in the way wounded pride concludes things, that she had simply chosen the better offer, that she had weighed him, heir to an earldom, modest income, a future, against a Duke of 56, with a title and an estate and a great deal of money, and had found him insufficient. He had been 24 years old, and it had felt absolutely definitive, the way things feel at 24. He had gone to Yorkshire and worked very hard for several years. His father had died in March of 1814, a swift and undramatic heart failure that left the estate in good order and the study full of papers that required sorting. Bertram had spent a week in that study, reading 30 years of correspondence and ledgers and the accumulated record of a man's life. And on the 4th day, in the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk, under 3 letters regarding a disputed boundary and 2 unopened invoices from a bookseller in York, he had found a letter in a woman's handwriting he did not recognize at first, because his name was there. But the postmark was 1812, and the paper was worn as though it had been unfolded and refolded many times. He had picked it up with the particular care one uses for things that might break, and he had read it. She had not simply explained. She had explained everything. The debts, the amount, the men, Thomas, the impossible arithmetic of it. She had written that she had no way to fix it except this, and no way to tell him directly, because she could not trust herself to speak it rather than write it. She had written that she was sorry, and that sorry was not enough, and that she had been unable to think of a word that was enough, and that the silence of the past weeks had been its own form of cowardice, which she owned fully. She had written, "I think you know by this point what I am not writing in this letter. I think you have known for some time." He had sat in his father's chair, his own chair now, and held her letter for a long time, and then he had put it very carefully in the desk's upper left drawer, where he could not know it was there, and he had gone downstairs and eaten dinner, and spoken to his estate manager for an hour about crop rotations, and he had thought with a clarity that surprised him. She was married. She was another man's wife. The letter was 5 years too late, and the letter was not a letter that could be responded to, and the letter was his to carry, and that was all. That was 2 years ago, and he had been carrying it since. He hadn't been carrying it well. He was prepared to admit this in the study to himself, with no audience to perform for. He had been carrying it the way one carries a stone in a coat pocket, badly, and with a low-grade, constant awareness of the weight, and a recurring impulse to put it down somewhere and walk away from it that he had thus far resisted, because he wasn't entirely certain, if he put it down, what putting it down meant. He had seen her at the ball. He had seen her at Agnes's this morning. He had said, "I am glad you came back to London." He had meant something larger than that, and she had heard that he meant something larger than that, and he had seen it in the way she'd paused, that quarter-inch stillness, and had not pursued it and had gone out into the January cold. He opened the drawer. He looked at the letter. He did not take it out. Not yet. Lord Percival Crane had been the late Duke of Aldenmere's cousin through the 4th removes of a complicated family arrangement Honora had never entirely followed, but which had been explained to her at some length at the beginning of her marriage. He was 53, lean, with the kind of polished affability that sat on the surface of everything he said like oil on water, pleasant to the eye, impossible to take hold of. He appeared at a musicale at Lady Hartley's house in Berkeley Square 9 days after Agnes's ball, which wasn't in itself suspicious. Crane had always frequented the same social events as the Aldenmere household. What was slightly unusual was the way he moved through the room to her side within 6 minutes of her arrival, and stayed there with the patient good manners of a man who had something to say and intended to take his time saying it. The music featured a soprano and a pianoforte, very good, a program of Handel and Arne. Honora listened, kept her eyes on the performers, and felt Crane's presence at her left shoulder with the same attention one gives a draught from a poorly fitted window. "You are looking remarkably well, Your Grace," he said during an interval, in the warm tone of a compliment that was also a statement of observation. 8 months already. How time moves." "It does," she said. "The estate," he said, "continues to do well, I hear. Price writes to me occasionally, out of courtesy." Price was the Aldenmere solicitor. She filed this information. "Mr. Price is very conscientious," she said. "He mentioned," Crane said in the same easy tone, "that the Aldenmere trust documents have certain provisions, specific to the question of remarriage. I wonder if you are fully acquainted with them." She turned to look at him then, very calmly. "I believe I am," she said. She was. She had read every document pertaining to the Aldenmere estate within a week of the Duke's death, because the Duke had respected her intelligence enough to ensure she understood what she was inheriting, and she had respected him enough to take that understanding seriously. The provision Crane was circling was in the 7th paragraph of the trust settlement. In the event of the Duchess's remarriage outside the direct Aldenmere family line within 18 months of widowhood, the secondary income from the Staffordshire tenancies, a sum of approximately £1,200 per annum, would revert to the family trust. It was not ruin. It was a significant reduction. "Then you'll know," Crane said pleasantly, "that there is a natural solution. Miles is a very good-natured young man. He has always admired you." Miles was Crane's son, Lord Miles Crane, who was 27 and perfectly amiable, and whom Honora had no intention of marrying. She looked at the musicians retuning at the front of the room, and she felt very precisely a form of cold anger she had learned, over the course of a difficult 4 years in London society, to keep almost entirely inside her own chest. "Lord Crane," she said pleasantly in return, "I have been widowed for 8 months. I am in half-mourning. I am not at present considering any remarriage whatsoever." "Of course not," he said, as though she had agreed with him. "Of course, there is plenty of time. I merely wanted you to know that the family, that I, had your interests very much at heart. The solution, when you come to it, need not be a difficult one. The soprano returned and the music began again. Crane, with perfect social timing, inclined his head and moved away to speak to someone else. Honora sat with her hands in her lap and breathed very carefully through her nose and thought about the Staffordshire tenancies and about Miles Crane and about £1,200 and about how very little she wanted to think about any of it. She thought about Bertram instead, which was not useful, but at least it was warm. Hyde Park in January wasn't what most people would choose for an afternoon walk. The Serpentine was grey and choppy under a flat sky, the paths were muddy at the margins, and the plane trees stood stripped and angular against the cold white. She walked there anyway on Thursday afternoons, because she had always walked on Thursday afternoons when she was in London and saw no reason to stop. Prudence walked 6 paces behind. Honora wore her pelisse over a deep charcoal wool walking dress and half boots that were sensible rather than fashionable, and she had been walking for 20 minutes along the south bank of the Serpentine, thinking about nothing in particular, which was the purpose of the exercise. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, a particular pace, measured, deliberate, not hurrying. She had the 3 seconds of knowing before she turned. He was in a dark greatcoat, his hat in his hand for some reason. He had been perhaps removing it in greeting to someone and had not replaced it, and his dark hair was catching the cold wind off the water. He paused briefly when he saw her. Then he kept walking. "Your Grace," he said as he came alongside. "My lord." A pause. "This is a coincidence." "I come here Thursdays," he said. She glanced at him. "So do I." He said nothing. They walked. She couldn't have said later at what point they became simply 2 people walking in the same direction at the same pace, rather than 2 people executing a social ceremony. It happened gradually, the way temperature changes, not in a moment, but in the accumulation of moments. The cold easing slightly in a sheltered bend of the path, the mud firming where gravel had been laid, the sky lightening almost imperceptibly to the south. "I wrote to you," she said. The path curved. He kept pace with her. "I know," he said. The stillness of that answer stopped her thinking for a moment. She had expected, she didn't know what she had expected. Denial, confusion. "You received it?" "No." He looked at the water. "I found it, in my father's desk in 1814. She absorbed this. The cold came in off the Serpentine, and its smell was iron and dead reeds. "Your father kept it." "My father kept it." She said nothing. She thought about the old Earl, formidable, correct, a man who would have read a letter addressed to his son and made a very efficient calculation about what was best for everyone and disposed of the evidence. She found she wasn't surprised exactly. She was something else, something that had no clean name, a mixture of sorrow and a strange, faint relief because, for 5 years she had believed he had read the letter and chosen not to respond, and that belief had been a specific kind of hurt, particular and heavy, and it was not quite the truth. "I thought," she said, "that you had read it and found it insufficient." He stopped walking. She stopped too. They stood on the Serpentine path with the grey water to their right and a stand of stripped willows to their left. He turned to look at her directly, and the verdejade of his eyes in the winter light was darker than usual, the colour of still water under shadow. "I found it 2 years after you married him," he said. "What would you have had me do?" "Nothing," she said. "I know there was nothing to do. I didn't mean—" She stopped. The wind came again, and she felt it in the gap between her collar and her ear. "I only wanted to know you had received it. I thought perhaps you believed I had simply chosen differently without a word." He was silent for a moment that felt long. "That is what I believed," he said, "for 2 years, until I found the letter." She looked at his face. It's set, not cold but careful, the way something is when it's been kept very carefully for a long time. "And after you found it?" she said quietly. He didn't answer immediately. A pair of ducks moved on the water below them. The willows moved in the wind. "After I found it," he said, "you were married, and I did not know what to do with the truth when there was nothing to be done with it." She looked at the water and felt something in her chest make a careful aching adjustment, like a joint that has been held at an unnatural angle for so long that the correction hurts. "And now?" she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The cold was very clear and the park was very quiet. "I don't know yet," he said. It was an honest answer. She appreciated honest answers. She appreciated that he hadn't said something false and neat, hadn't performed certainty he didn't have. She said, "I don't know yet either," and meant it. And they walked the rest of the path in a silence that was, for the first time in 5 years, not uncomfortable. Thomas Sinclair's house in Bloomsbury was modest in the specific way of houses belonging to young men who have learned the hard way to live within their means. Everything in it was of middling quality, but extremely well kept, the rugs clean, and the windows clean, and the small fire burning efficiently rather than generously. His wife, a sensible young woman named Eliza, brought tea and then found a reason to be elsewhere with an instinct Honora admired. Thomas was 25 and looked, as he always had, like a slightly less composed version of their late father. The same dark eyes, the same way of running a hand through his hair when he was thinking, the same habit of folding and unfolding the corner of whatever paper was nearest to him. He had been folding a copy of the Times since she sat down. "You've seen him," he said, after she had told him nothing beyond the fact that she had been at Agnes's ball. She gave him a look. "You have a very particular face," he said without apology. "You've always had it. It means you are thinking about something you don't want to think about, and the only thing that makes you look like that is—" "Yes," she said. "All right. I've seen him." He put the Times down and looked at her with the direct concern of a brother who has known her all her life. "How was it?" She looked at her tea. "He found my letter," she said, "the one I sent in 1812. His father kept it. He found it after the old Earl died in the desk." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, "God." "Yes." "He thought you hadn't written. All that time." "For 2 years," she said. "He was under that impression for 2 years, while I was married to the Duke, and he thought I had simply gone, without explanation." Thomas sat back in his chair and pressed his fingers to his lips, in the way he did when he was ordering his thoughts. "Does he blame you for it?" "He doesn't seem to. He seems—" She stopped. "Honest. He seems to be trying to be honest, which is more than I had any right to expect." She looked at the fire. "He said he didn't know what to do with the truth when there was nothing to be done with it." Her brother's eyes were soft and steady on her face. "What did you say?" "That I didn't know either." "Honora." He leaned forward. "Tell him everything. Tell him about me. The debts, the full amount, why I couldn't tell you sooner, why there was no other way. Tell him." She looked at him. "It was 5 years ago." "It was 5 years ago and he's still in the same room as you," Thomas said. "That means something. Men who are finished don't come back to the same room." He paused. "Tell him. You should have told him then. I've told you that for 5 years. You told me to tell him then," she said. "Once, and then you didn't bring it up again." "Because you were married," he said gently, "because there was nothing to be done with it then, same as he said. But now," he spread his hands, "now there is something to be done with it, if you choose to." She sat for a long time with the tea going cold in her cup and the small fire burning its small fire, and she thought about choice, about the choices she had made and the choices she had not made, and the space between them, which was where the last 5 years had been lived. "I'm afraid," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I'm afraid that it's too late, that he knows the facts of it now, but the hurt has been too long and too fixed, and the knowing doesn't—" "You won't know until you tell him," Thomas said. "That's the thing about conversations you've been putting off. You think you know how they'll go. You don't know anything until you're in them." She went home through the Bloomsbury streets, with the carriage rocking over the February cobbles, and Prudence reading a small book of sermons across from her, with the absolute contentment of someone whose conscience was not troubled. Honora looked out the window at London moving past and thought, tell him everything. She thought, "I will, when the time is right." She had been saying that for 5 years. He was alone in the study on a Wednesday evening, a fortnight after Agnes's ball. The fire was low because he hadn't noticed it going low, which meant he had been thinking rather than reading for some time, which was what the book open and unread on the desk suggested as well. He opened the drawer. He had opened this drawer at intervals for 2 years. Not often. He wasn't a man who came back to things constantly, but often enough to know the letter by sight rather than by decision, to know it was there without reaching for it. Tonight, he took it out. The paper wasn't as fragile as it had become in his mind. It was worn at the folds, slightly yellowed at the margins, but it was paper, not the fixed and irrevocable thing it sometimes felt like when he wasn't looking at it. He unfolded it on the desk in front of him. He had read it many times by now. He knew where the ink went thin at the turn of the page, where her pen had pressed harder at the words she meant more than the others. He knew the shape of her H in his name. He knew the exact paragraph, the third one halfway down, where the handwriting, which had been careful and composed until that point, became something else, tighter, slightly uneven, the words of someone writing faster than her control could fully manage. She had written, "I have no way to explain this to you that is adequate. There are things I have not said, that I cannot say in a letter, that I believe you have seen in me, in these past months, if you have looked. I believe you have looked." He looked away from the letter and at the fire, which was lower than it should have been. He knew now why she had married the Duke. He had known for 2 years. He understood, with genuine understanding, not the intellectual acknowledgement that comes before real feeling. The arithmetic of Thomas's debts and a family's options, the position she had been placed in through no design of her own, the choice she had made and what it had cost her to make it. He was not angry at her for it. He had stopped being angry at her for it when he read the letter and reread it and understood it. What he was still carrying was something less clean than anger and less simple than grief. It was the specific ache of knowing what might have been, not as a generalized regret, but as a very particular and detailed knowledge, because he had known her long enough and well enough to know what that life might have contained, the conversations that would have gone on past the point where they stopped, the morning light in the study at Ravenscroft Park with 2 cups of coffee and nobody to be polite to, the winter evenings, the summer mornings, the ordinary accumulation of days that were the only thing that mattered in the end. He had been very careful, for 2 years, not to think about those things with too much resolution. Blurred was easier. Blurred allowed him to function. Then she had come back to London, and she had been so specifically herself in the doorway of Agnes's ballroom, and the blur had not survived it. He folded the letter. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat, which was not where he usually kept it. He sat for a moment with his hand flat against his chest, feeling the slight stiffness of the paper through 2 layers of wool. Then he went upstairs and asked his valet Finch to lay out his things for the morning, because he intended to go out early and wanted to be presentable. The Pantheon on Oxford Street had been, at various points in its history, a place of assemblies, a theatre, and an opera house. In February of 1817, it was hosting a charity concert in aid of the widows and children of soldiers who had died at Waterloo. It was the kind of event that required attendance rather than invited it. Half of Mayfair came, because the other half would notice if they did not, and because the music was generally very good, and because charity was one of the few things one could enjoy publicly without being accused of ostentation. Honora arrived with Agnes and Richard. She wore dark grey, not quite half-mourning, with a small brooch of garnets at the collar that had been the Duke's gift on their first Christmas. She had worn it to signal, to herself as much as anyone, that she was prepared to be present. Not performing grief, present. The concert was in the large upper room. Rows of chairs arranged before a raised platform where a small orchestra and a baritone were to perform. Honora found their seats, greeted the Pembertons, and settled in for what she anticipated would be a solid 2 hours of being seen and hearing music. She saw Crane within 10 minutes. He was 3 rows back, with his son Miles, who was indeed perfectly amiable. Tall, fair, with the look of a young man who has been raised to be good-natured and has succeeded without particular effort. Miles caught her eye and inclined his head. She inclined hers. Crane, behind him, watched this exchange with the satisfaction of a man tallying small wins. The music began. The baritone sang Handel, deeply with a steadiness that was its own form of comfort, and the room settled into the particular hush of people who were genuinely listening. Honora let herself listen too. Let the music do what music does. Make the walls between the inside and outside of one's chest slightly more permeable. At the interval, the room shifted and recomposed itself into conversation clusters. Honora rose and moved toward the far side of the room, where a window looked over Oxford Street, and a table of refreshments had been laid. She was reaching for a glass of water when she felt Crane at her elbow. He was not aggressive. He was never aggressive. He was the kind of man who was so consistently pleasant that the unpleasantness became invisible, buried under layers of good manners, until it was doing quite a lot of work without ever being directly noticed. "Your Grace," he said. "Extraordinary music. Handel never fails, does he?" "Never," she agreed. "I notice you have been in London some weeks now." He poured himself a glass of water. "Getting back into things, as it were. Very sensible. I was saying to Miles just this morning." "Lord Crane," she turned to face him, "I believe I made my thoughts on your suggestion quite clear at Lady Hartley's." "Of course," he said pleasantly. "Of course, I was only—" "I will not be pressured," she said quietly enough that no one passing could hear, "into a remarriage of any kind, on any timeline, by anyone. The Staffordshire provisions are in the documents, and I have read them and I understand them. I am prepared to accept their terms rather than their alternative." Crane's smile did not change on its surface, but something behind it shifted, tightened. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, equally quietly, "You are a very determined woman, Your Grace." "I am," she said. "Yes." She turned back to the refreshment table and found on the other side of it Bertram Ravenscroft. He had arrived at the interval, apparently. She hadn't seen him in the room before. He stood with a glass of water and an expression that suggested he had heard enough of her exchange with Crane to follow its shape, if not its specific content. "Lord Crane," he said, looking past her, his tone perfectly level. "I haven't seen you since last autumn. You were at Lord Hathersham's, I believe." Crane turned. The two men exchanged the particular version of a polite greeting that contains, beneath its surface, a reading of relative social standing, and the reading went in Bertram's favor without any visible effort on his part. Crane was a lord by courtesy. His title came through the family arrangement, not in his own right. Bertram was an earl. In the arithmetic of the room, this was not subtle. "Ravenscroft," Crane said, with his affable warmth. "Good to see you." "And you." Bertram glanced at the window. "Dreadful evening for it. The fog's coming in, I think. I trust Miles is well. He's looking very fit." It was perfectly done. The social ease, the move from Crane to his son, with a friendliness that wasn't false, but that also constituted a very clean end to the conversation. Crane took it because there was nothing else to take, and moved back toward Miles. Honora stood with her glass of water and looked at Bertram. He was looking at Crane's retreating back. "Did he threaten you?" he said, when Crane was out of earshot. "He made a suggestion," she said. "With financial appendices." He looked at her then. His eyes were, in the light of the Pantheon chandeliers, very green. "Are you managing it?" "Quite well," she said. "Though I appreciate—" She stopped, started again. "I appreciate you removing him." "I didn't do anything." "You know exactly what you did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Are you all right?" The question was simple and direct, and she found it considerably more difficult to receive than she had expected. She pressed the edge of her water glass briefly to her lips. "I am managing," she said, which was true in all the ways that mattered. "Thank you, my lord." He looked at her for one more moment, the way he used to look at her across the garden at Ashfield, working something out. Then the orchestra called the room back to its seats, and they went in, and she sat with Agnes and heard the second half of the concert, with the warmth of it still on her cheek where she imagined his attention had been, which was completely irrational and completely real. She had kept it in a box. This wasn't in itself remarkable. Women of her station kept things in boxes, letters, ribbons, the small residue of a life arranged for the eye of no one. The box in question was lacquered rosewood, a Christmas gift from the late Duke in 1814. It sat on the low table beside her writing desk in the upstairs sitting room of Aldenmere House. Nobody had ever asked about it, and she had never offered. The letter was at the bottom, under a dried violet from a summer garden, not Ashfield, a later one somewhere else, and a folded card with a poem written in her own handwriting that she had composed when she was 22 and never shown anyone, and 2 letters from Thomas from the difficult year, which she kept because they reminded her what the choice had been for. The letter to Bertram was underneath all of it. She had written it the night before her wedding. Not the first letter, the one she had sent, the one his father had intercepted, the careful one with the necessary facts and the insufficient explanations. This was the second letter, the one she had started and then could not stop writing. The one that began, "I am to be married in the morning, and I am sitting at this desk at 11:30 at night, and I find that what I have written you in the past weeks is nowhere near enough." She had written it all, everything she hadn't put in the careful letter, about the garden party at Ashfield and the shuttlecock and the particular quality of the August light, about the way he listened and the way she had found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, and the way that had frightened her because she wasn't by temperament a woman who said important things aloud, about the bench in the Hathawsham garden in September and what she had thought sitting next to him, the thought about spending the rest of her life in conversations like this. She had written that thought exactly, with no softening, because it was true, and it was the last night she would be permitted the particular freedom of it. She had written, "I chose Thomas's life over my own. I believe it was right. I believe I would make the same choice again in the same circumstances, and that is the thing that is destroying me most, because it means I cannot even have the comfort of knowing I made a mistake." She had written, "I do not know if this reaches you. I do not know if you will want it to. I am writing it because it is the only honest thing I have left tonight, and tomorrow the honest things will have to be put away." She had written, "I love you." I should have said it when there was a bench to say it from. She had signed it and folded it and addressed it, and then sat looking at it for half an hour and thought, "I cannot send this. If he reads this, he will spend his life knowing. That is worse than not knowing. A man who knows he was loved and lost carries it differently than a man who can tell himself it was never real. Let him have the easier version. She had not sent it. She had kept it under a dried violet in a rosewood box for 5 years, on the grounds that she could not send it, and could not destroy it. And those were the only 2 options, and so it would have to wait in the box until she found a third one. She sat at the writing desk now in the upstairs sitting room, on a February afternoon with the fire going properly and the street below gone quiet in the cold. She took the letter out of the box and unfolded it. She read it twice. Then she refolded it and held it in both hands for a moment, the edges of the paper pressing lightly into her palms, and she thought about Thomas saying, tell him everything," and about Bertram in the park saying, "I did not know what to do with the truth when there was nothing to be done with it," and about the Pantheon, and "Are you all right?" and the particular quality of the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching. She put the letter back in the box. She closed the box and sat for a long time. She was still afraid. That was the truth of it, and she would not pretend otherwise. Not of what he felt. She had, by now, reasonable grounds to believe what he felt. What she was afraid of was simpler and more stubborn. The fear of needing someone this specifically and this completely, and the knowledge of what it felt like when that need had nowhere to go. She had managed the fear for 5 years. She did not know how much longer she intended to. He sent no note. She was in the drawing-room at Aldenmere House on a Wednesday morning when Prudence came to say Lord Ravenscroft was downstairs, and she said yes before she had decided to say yes, and then she was descending the stairs with her hands very steady at her sides. He was standing in the front drawing-room in his morning coat, and he had brought with him in his breast pocket the letter. She didn't know this yet. She registered the coat, the hat he was holding by the brim, the way he turned when she entered, and the way he looked at her, direct, careful, resolved in some way he hadn't been the last time she had seen him. "Lord Ravenscroft," she said. "I need you to see something," he said. He reached into his coat and brought out the letter. Her letter, 5 years old, the paper worn at the folds, her own handwriting on the front with his name, and the Ravenscroft Park address. He set it on the table between them. He said nothing else. She looked at it, her own handwriting, The address she had known by heart in October of 1812, the address she had written on the envelope without needing to consult anything. The E and the C of Ravenscroft slightly joined the way they always joined when she wrote quickly. She stood very still. "Where did you get that?" she said, though she already knew. "My father's desk." He remained on the other side of the table, not touching the letter, not looking at it, looking at her. "I told you, in the park. I found it in 1814, in the bottom drawer, under correspondence. He had not destroyed it. He had simply kept it where I would not think to look." She sat down. Not decisively. Her legs made the decision, and she followed. She sat in the chair nearest to her and looked at the letter on the table. "He read it," she said. "He must have. It had been opened and refolded. He would have read it and decided—" He stopped. "He would have decided it was better this way." "Better," she said. The word had a strange texture in her mouth. "He was not a bad man." She heard in his voice the particular compression of a complicated feeling into a simple statement. He was a man who thought he knew what was best and acted on it without consulting anyone whose life it was. I believe he thought he was protecting me. She looked up at him. He was still standing across the table, but the quality of his stillness had changed. The resolution she had felt when she came in was still there, but underneath it was something raw, something less managed. She thought, "He has been carrying this for 2 years and he is putting it down in this room, and the putting down costs something." "I thought you hadn't answered," she said. "For 5 years. I thought you had read it and decided I wasn't worth the response." "I know," he said. "That was what I believed about you." "I know." She looked at the letter. "And you have believed for 2 years that you knew the truth and I was married and there was nothing to be done." "Yes," he said. "And now?" He came around the table then. Not quickly. Nothing he did was quick. It was one of the things she had always known about him, the deliberateness of his movements, the sense that he was never doing anything without having chosen to do it. He stood near her and did not sit and did not touch anything, and he said, "Now you are not married, and I have been carrying this letter for 2 years, and I am tired of carrying it alone." The room was very quiet. The house was quiet around it. No traffic from the square yet. The servants below stairs going quietly about the morning. Prudence upstairs with no reason to come down. The fire ticked in the grate. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. His jaw had the tension in it, the careful choosing of words. His verde jade eyes were very green in the grey morning light. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it. Thomas, the amount, why there was no other way. Tell me." She told him. She told him about the letter, the 2 in the morning handwriting, the £3,040, the men Thomas owed it to, the very specific nature of the danger. She told him about the Duke's offer, and the one night she had spent thinking about it, and what she had thought during that night. She told him about her mother's face when Honora explained it, and the way her mother had said nothing, and then said yes, and had never mentioned Bertram's name again. She told him about writing the careful letter first. She told him about watching the footman take it. And then she stood up, and she went to the writing desk in the corner of the drawing room. She had one in nearly every room, a habit from a lifetime of correspondence, and she opened the small drawer where she had put the letter that morning, because she had taken it from the rosewood box and brought it down with her, for a reason she had not named to herself until this moment. She took it out. She turned to face him. "I wrote this one too," she said. "The night before my wedding. I did not send it." He took it from her hands. She felt the transfer of it, the paper passing between them, the slight cold of his fingers brushing hers. He looked at her once, briefly, and then he read it. She had told herself on the way down the stairs this morning that she would watch his face while he read it and use what she saw to calibrate what came next. She found she could not watch his face. She looked at the window instead, at the grey February light on the Mayfair rooftops, and she stood very still and waited. It wasn't a long letter. It had never been a long letter. She heard his breath, the slight shift of the paper as he turned the page. She did not look. When the paper stilled, she looked. He was looking at her. His eyes were bright, not with tears. but with the brightness that comes from holding something very still under a great deal of pressure. That brightness that is adjacent to tears, without quite being them. He had both his hands around the letter, and they were not entirely steady. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You loved me." "Yes," she said. "You loved me, and you thought I never knew." "I thought," she said carefully, "that you might have guessed. I hoped for a long time that that was enough." "It wasn't," he said, not as a reproach, as a fact, stated plainly. "I needed you to say it. I was 24, and I had never—" He stopped, began again. "I was going to say it first, in Derbyshire. I was going to ask you to marry me in Derbyshire, and I didn't quite get there in time." She thought about Derbyshire, the letter, the September morning, the choice. "No," she said softly, "you didn't." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire ticked. Outside, the first sounds of the square beginning its morning. A horse, a call, the rattle of a cart. "I forgave you," he said, "the moment I read this letter." He looked at the paper in his hands. "I should have told you so before now." She felt something in her chest give way very quietly, not break, but release, as though something that had been held at tension for a very long time had finally been permitted to rest. She pressed her hand briefly to her sternum. It wasn't elegant. She didn't particularly care. "I am telling you now," he said. "Whatever you need me to say, whatever helps, I forgave you. I was not ready to say so. I am saying it now." She looked at him, this man who was and was not the man she had known in 1812, who had the same jaw and the same eyes and the same deliberate quality of movement, but who had become, in the 5 years between then and now, something heavier and more complete, someone who had lived in his own silence and come out the other side of it still himself. She thought, "I have been afraid of this conversation for 5 years. I should have had it sooner. I should have written more letters." She didn't say this. What she said was his name, not his title, not his lord, his name, Bertram, quietly, for the first time in 5 years, and watched the effect of it on his face, the slight private alteration, the something giving way behind the eyes. "Yes," he said. "Stay," she said, "for breakfast. I'll have it sent up." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw the edge of something he almost smiled at. Then he set her letter carefully on the table beside his, and he sat down. The breakfast came and they ate it, and the strangeness of the ordinary was its own particular mercy. Prudence appeared once, assessed the situation with the rapid competence of a woman who has been a lady's maid for 12 years, and therefore has seen everything and judged almost none of it, and withdrew to manage the household. The drawing-room door remained ajar in the manner required by propriety, and propriety was satisfied, and the 2 letters sat on the table between the coffee pot and the toast rack and made no demands. He ate 2 pieces of toast. She drank her coffee and was grateful for its warmth and the fact that ordinary things existed and could be attended to. Her hands had stopped being unsteady about 10 minutes into it, which she considered a reasonable recovery time. He told her about the 2 years since finding the letter, not all of it, not as a confession but as an account of what the knowledge had been like, what it had required him to carry. He told her about the Yorkshire winters, the estate work, the particular usefulness of hard physical labor, for a man whose inner life was giving him trouble. He told her about coming to London last season and going to 3 assemblies and then leaving early and going back to Yorkshire. He told her this without self-pity and without performing the wounds, which was one of the things she had always liked most about him, that he could speak of difficult things without requiring her to manage his relationship to them. She told him about the Duke, not to be useful or to fill silence, but because he deserved the accurate picture, the man as he had actually been, rather than the convenient shorthand of a bad marriage. The Duke had been kind. He had been consistent. He had been, in his way, a good partner for the life they had made together, and she had not regretted the marriage in any of the ways that made a person mean or resentful. She had simply not been in love with him, and that absence had been, not painful exactly, more like weather. The permanent, slightly overcast that isn't dramatic enough to complain about, but is also never quite the day you wanted. Bertram listened. He asked once whether she had been happy. She thought about it carefully before answering. Not unhappy. There's a difference. He nodded, as though this was a distinction he had suspected and was relieved to have confirmed. The coffee pot was empty. The fire had settled to a steady heat. Outside, the square had come properly to life. Carriage wheels, footsteps, the specific percussion of London mid-morning. "Crane," he said, setting down his cup. "The provision in the trust." "I told him I would accept the financial consequence rather than the alternative," she said. "You would lose the Staffordshire income." "Yes, 1,200 per annum. It's significant, but it's not ruin." She looked at the coffee pot. "I'm not entirely without resources. The Duke left the household arrangements in good order." He was quiet for a moment. She recognized the particular quality of this quiet, the sort that means he is thinking something specific and is deciding how to say it. "Would you allow me to look at the trust document?" he said. "The specific language of the provision." She looked at him. "You're not a solicitor." "No," he said, "but I have one. And I suspect, from the way Crane worded his suggestion, that the language is not as watertight as he implied. These provisions are generally written to manage family property, not to compel widows to marry specific people. The courts have been," he paused, "unsympathetic in recent years to the more coercive readings." She felt something that was almost amusement and almost relief, and something else that was neither. "Are you proposing to challenge it on my behalf?" "I am proposing," he said, "to have my solicitor look at it. Whether anything comes of that depends on what he finds." She looked at him across the remains of breakfast, the 2 letters still on the table in the background. In the morning light, he was very real, not the version she had been carrying in her memory, which was younger and softer, but this version, which had more in it. More that had happened to him, more that had been decided and weathered and held. "All right," she said. "Yes, I'll have Price send you the documents." He nodded. He didn't make it a larger thing than it was, which was another thing she had always liked about him. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down with the mild, philosophical acceptance of a man who has learned that coffee cups do eventually empty. "You were going to say it first," she said. It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her. "In Derbyshire?" "Yes." "What would you have said?" The faintest alteration in his expression, not quite a smile but related to one. "I believe I had several versions, all of them substantially inadequate to the occasion." "As it happens," she said, "I had an occasion I was ready for and never got to use it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What would you have said?" She considered him across the table, the grey February light, the 2 letters that had waited 5 years to be in the same room. She had, after all, just handed him the version that said everything, the unsent letter, everything she had not said. She supposed that covered most of it. "I believe," she said. "You've already read it." He looked at the letter on the table and then back at her, and this time the thing that was almost a smile was something warmer and more specific, and it stayed. His solicitor was named Aldous Finch, a dry, precise man of 60, with an extraordinary memory for precedent and no patience for provisions that had been badly worded in order to function as threats. Bertram put the Aldenmere Trust documents in front of him on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of February, and Mr. Finch read them with the focused attention of a man who finds legal language to be, in its own way, entertaining. After 40 minutes, he looked up over his spectacles. "This," he said, "is not a coercive provision. It is a contingency. The distinction is significant." Bertram said, "Go on." The distinction, as Mr. Finch laid it out with the care of a man who enjoyed his work, was between a provision that prevented something and a provision that was triggered by something. The Aldenmere Trust provision did not prohibit the Duchess from remarrying outside the family. It simply redistributed the income from the Staffordshire tenancies if she did. The provision had been written in 1798, at the time of the 4th Duke's marriage to his first wife, and its language was of that era, precise about the financial consequence, but silent on any requirement of action or inaction on the Duchess's part. Crane, in other words, was correct about the money. He was not correct in his implication that the money was a lever with which he could direct the Duchess's choices. Furthermore, said Mr. Finch, the specific income from the Staffordshire tenancies is derived from a separate leaseholder arrangement that was renegotiated in 1811. Whether the original trust provision applies to income derived from a later arrangement is a question I would very much enjoy arguing before the appropriate court, should it arise. Bertram considered this, and the likelihood of it arising. That depends, said Mr. Finch, on whether Lord Crane's solicitors are competent enough to risk testing it. If they are, they will advise him not to. The provision's ambiguity works in Her Grace's favour rather than against it. Bertram left Mr. Finch's offices on Gray's Inn Road with the particular satisfaction of a problem that has been examined and found to be significantly smaller than it appeared. He walked back toward Grosvenor Square through the February cold. It was a proper cold now, the beginning of the freeze that had arrived the previous week, the pavements laced with ice at the edges, and he thought about what to do with what he now knew. The direct route was to tell Honora. That was simple enough, but there was also the question of Crane, and whether leaving Crane with his misapprehension intact was useful, or whether correcting it would, in fact, produce better results for everyone. Specifically, whether Crane would leave Honora alone, if he understood his position was weaker than he believed. Bertram had a small number of direct qualities, and a very well-developed understanding of social leverage. He used the second sparingly, and never enjoyed it particularly, but there were cases in which social leverage was the most efficient tool available, and this appeared to be one of them. He wrote a note that afternoon to Lord Crane, requesting a brief meeting at his club at 3 o'clock on Thursday, as he had a matter of mutual interest to discuss. The phrasing was cordial, the timing, a members' club, his own ground, mid-afternoon, was specific. Crane came. They sat in armchairs in the morning room, which at 3 in the afternoon was largely empty, with the fire going and the winter light flat in the windows. Bertram ordered tea. He did not hurry. "I understand," he said, when the tea had been poured and Crane had made his pleasantries, "that you have brought to the Duchess of Aldenmere's attention a provision in the Aldenmere Trust." Crane's expression did not change. It was very good at not changing. "A family matter," he said. "She is technically family." "Technically," Bertram agreed. "My solicitor has had occasion to look at the trust documents this week with particular attention to the provision you referenced." He paused. "He has an interesting view of it." Crane set down his cup. "Has he?" "He does." Bertram looked at the fire. "It's a contingency, as it turns out, not a prohibition. The courts have been fairly consistent on that distinction in recent years, and there's a question about the 1811 lease arrangement and whether the original provision applies to income derived from it. Mr. Finch thinks it a very interesting question." "Mr. Finch," Crane said. "Aldous Finch of Gray's Inn. You may know his work." Bertram looked at him pleasantly. "The point, Lord Crane, is that the provision is significantly less clear than I suspect you represented it to the Duchess. Her legal position, were she to choose to remarry anyone she wished, is considerably stronger than your implied reading suggested." Crane looked at him for a moment with the flat assessment of a man recalculating. He was intelligent. Bertram had always known this and had never underestimated it. The intelligence showed now in the speed of the recalculation and in the fact that Crane did not waste energy on denial. "I see," Crane said. "Good," Bertram said. "I thought you would." He poured more tea for both of them, and they spoke for the next 20 minutes about something entirely different. A bill before Parliament, the state of the winter roads into Berkshire. And then Crane excused himself, and Bertram sat alone with the fire and finished his tea and thought that was that. Honora received a note from Crane 2 days later, through his solicitor, indicating that upon review the family trust provisions were not a matter requiring the Duchess's immediate attention, and that Lord Crane wished her every happiness in her continuing residence at Aldenmere House. She read this note at breakfast and then read it a second time, and then poured her tea and thought, "Bertram." And then, "I should thank him." And then, "I should do more than thank him." She put down her cup and wrote a note, and sent Prudence out with it before she changed her mind. He came that afternoon. She had a fire going in the upstairs sitting room, not the drawing room, which was formal, but the sitting room where she wrote her letters and kept her rosewood box and spent most of the hours that were actually hers. He came in and looked at the room briefly, the way he looked at things, with the attention of someone cataloguing what's important. "Crane has withdrawn," she said. "Has he?" he said, as though he had not known this was going to happen. "You know perfectly well he has." She looked at him steadily. "You should have told me before you went to your solicitor." He sat down in the chair she pointed to, which was across from hers. The fire between them was warm and the light outside was fading toward the grey-blue of a February late afternoon. "I should have asked whether you wanted me to," he said. "You're right. I am managing my own affairs." "I know you are." He looked at her with those eyes that she was finally allowing herself to look directly at for as long as she liked. "I was not doing it because I thought you couldn't. I was doing it because I could, and because—" He stopped. "Because it was something I could do. That was available to me to do." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about 5 years of letters and things she should have said, and about the particular quality of something offered without drama and without condition, simply because it was available to be offered. She thought, this is who he is. This is who he has always been, and I left that to sit in a room alone for 5 years. "Thank you," she said, "for managing it." "You're welcome." She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire. He looked at the fire too. The room held them both quietly. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment. He waited. "About what comes next." She kept her eyes on the fire. "I am 8 months widowed. The appropriate period is a year, generally, for a woman in my position. Perhaps a little less, given—" She paused. "Given the nature of the marriage, which was not a love match and was never represented as one." He said nothing. "In 4 months," she said, "it will be June. The season will be at its peak." She glanced at him. "A great many things are possible in June that are not possible in February." He was very still in his chair, the contained stillness she had always known. Then he said, "Are you telling me to wait 4 months?" "I am telling you," she said, "that I would prefer to do things properly. Whatever we—" She stopped. "Whatever this is, I would prefer it to be done properly, so that no one has anything to say about it." He looked at her. His expression had the quality of someone who has been holding a door handle for a long time and is being told they can let go soon. "4 months," he said. "Give or take," she said. He nodded once in the decided way that meant he had filed this information and would act on it without requiring further discussion. Then he said very quietly, "May I ask one thing?" "Yes." "The letter you gave me." He was looking at the fire again. "May I keep it?" She felt something warm and absolutely certain settle in her chest. "Yes," she said. "Yes. I would like you to have it." He looked at her then, the full weight of his attention, and she met it. The fire went on burning between them, and the city went on outside, and there were 4 months to wait, and she thought, yes. Let's wait properly. Let's do this right. Every Duchess has a story the world forgot to ask about. This one was about 2 letters, the one that was sent and intercepted, and the one that was never sent and waited 5 years in a rosewood box to be read by the right person in the right room. It was about a choice made at 2 in the morning for a brother who was drowning, and the cost of that choice, and the question of whether costs of that size can be balanced out in the long accounting of a life. And it was about a man who found a letter in a dead man's desk, and spent 2 years deciding whether truth could live without action, and discovered in the end that it could not. The climax came in April. She told him at last, sitting across from him in the upstairs sitting room on an April evening, the windows open a careful inch to the first real warmth of the year, the smell of London in spring coming through on the air, that she was afraid, not of him, not of the choice, of the irreversibility of hope, that she had spent 5 years not hoping, because not hoping was a manageable condition, and hoping was not manageable in the least. And now she was hoping, and it frightened her in a way that everything difficult she had previously endured had not, because she had endured those things from a position of control, and this could not be controlled. He listened. She finished speaking. The room was quiet. The spring air moved through the window inch with the smell of horse and blossom and coal smoke. He said, I know exactly what you mean. He was very still. I have been afraid of the same thing for 3 years, since I found the letter, since I knew the truth and did not know what to do with it. Hoping was not available to me then, and when it became available again, I did not know how to pick it up. She looked at him. Honora, he said, and the way he said her name, the specific texture of it, unhurried, no prefix, nothing attached. I have loved you since the summer of 1812. I have loved you at Ashfield and in London and in Yorkshire, in 3 winters and in 2 years of knowing and doing nothing, and in all the evenings of this particular winter. I was going to say it in Derbyshire, and I did not get there in time, and I am saying it now. She pressed both hands to her face briefly. Not weeping, something prior to weeping, the pressure of finding the nearest available release. Then she lowered her hands and she looked at him. I love you, she said. I have said it once, in a letter I never sent, and I am saying it now to your face, which is better. He crossed the room, not quickly. Nothing he did was quick. He crossed the room with the deliberateness she knew, and he took her hands, both of them, and held them, and the warmth of his hands was very real, and the room was very real, and outside London was doing what London did, indifferent and continuous, and in here there was only this, the two of them and the fact of what they had just said. He said, I would like to court you properly, whatever time you need, whatever form is right. June, she said, at the latest. He smiled. It was the full version, the one she had seen once across a drawing room, quick and private, the one that creased the corner of his eye. June, he agreed. They sat together in the open-windowed room with the April evening moving through it, and they did not let go of each other's hands for a very long time. The resolution was simpler than the complications that had preceded it. Courtship, conducted with the propriety that Honora had asked for, and that Bertram honored without difficulty, because he had the patience of a man who has spent 3 years learning to be patient and knows the value of doing things correctly. They were seen together, at appropriate occasions under appropriate conditions. Agnes's musical evening in March, the charity exhibition at the Royal Academy in April, a dinner at Lord and Lady Pemberton's in May, where Honora sat beside him, and no one was surprised by this, and the gossip machines of Mayfair began to rotate their gears with the satisfaction of a foregone conclusion in progress. Thomas met him in April. They sat in Thomas's small Bloomsbury parlour and drank tea and spoke for an hour, and Honora sat between them and watched the two men regard each other across the conversation with the careful honesty of people who have no reason to perform anything for each other's benefit. Thomas, when it was over and Bertram had gone, said, yes, simply, with no further elaboration, and Honora understood that yes covered everything required. Crane did not resurface. The Staffordshire provisions remained uncontested. Mr. Finch wrote a neat 2-page summary of the legal position and filed it in case of future need, with the professional satisfaction of a man who enjoys having done thorough work. Outreau, June, 1817. The morning room of Aldenmere House in the second week of June was full of light. The curtains were pulled back, and the window was open, and London was doing its midsummer thing. Warm air, and the smell of cut grass from the square below, and the sound of horses and children and all the ordinary London machinery that ran regardless of what happened to anyone inside any given house. Honora was at the writing desk. She was composing a letter to her mother about the arrangements for the following week, because her mother would require a great deal of detail in advance, and Honora knew this about her and planned accordingly. Bertram was in the wing chair she had installed for him in the past month, at a slight angle to the desk, so that the light fell across his book without bothering her eyes, reading something to do with agricultural drainage in the North Riding, which she had been informed was a very pressing matter. They were engaged. It had been settled last Tuesday in the garden of the Grosvenor Square house, his garden, which was smaller than she had imagined it, with 3 rose bushes that were not quite in bloom and a plane tree that was very much in bloom, and it had been settled with a particular simplicity. He had said that he would like very much for this to be permanent, and she had said yes, please, very much. And they had stood in the not-quite-bloomed garden and been both of them so thoroughly relieved that neither of them said anything else for a full minute. And then she had laughed, and so had he, and that had been more or less the proposal. The engagement was to be announced on Thursday. Agnes already knew because Agnes had figured it out approximately 6 weeks before it happened and had said nothing, which was one of the many things that made Agnes worth knowing. Thomas knew. Mrs. Sinclair would know after the letter was sent this morning. Honora was on the 4th paragraph of her letter to Mrs. Sinclair when Bertram turned a page and said, without looking up from the drainage report, "I've moved the afternoon appointments." She looked up. Which ones? The ones at 3, Mr. Aldous and the Wiltshire factor. She put down her pen. You moved them. To 4. He turned another page. I thought we might walk in the park at 3. It's a Thursday. She considered this. Thursday was their day. It had been since January their day, the Thursday walk by the Serpentine, the one they had discovered they both kept before they had decided to keep it together, which had struck her at the time as evidence of something. I see, she said, and you decided this without consulting me. I consulted your social diary, he said. You have nothing at 3. That is not the same as consulting me. He looked up from the drainage report. His eyes, that particular verde jade, which she had given up pretending she was not entirely partial to, held a very faint amusement that he was managing with professional seriousness. Would you prefer to stay in? I would prefer, she said, to be asked. Would you like to walk in the park at 3? Yes, she said. Thank you for asking. He returned to the drainage report with the expression of a man who has learned something and filed it, and will apply it again. She returned to her letter. She wrote 3 more sentences, and then stopped and looked at the room, the light in it, the open window, the man in the wing chair who was reading about drainage, and had moved an appointment, and would concede the point without drama when it was pointed out, and would still almost certainly rearrange things at 3 without asking again in a fortnight, because he was who he was. She thought, I could spend the rest of my life in mornings like this. I could spend the rest of my life at this desk with that man in that chair, and I would not need the desk or the chair or the light in the window at all. She had thought something very like this on a bench in September of 1812, and had not said it. She had said something about rose bushes. She put down her pen. She looked at him across the room. Bertram, she said. He looked up. I love you, she said, on a Tuesday morning with the window open. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when something had reached him and he was receiving it properly. Then he said, I know. A pause. I love you. On a Wednesday in February, and a Thursday in January, and in every weather I have found you in. He closed the drainage report. And on a Tuesday morning with the window open. She picked up her pen and finished her letter. Every Duchess has a story the world forgot to ask about.